So now a few thoughts on a subject to which I and we have been invited as part of a partnership between Emanu and a group called Scientists and Synagogues, whose mission is to bridge what is sometimes perceived as a divide between faith and science by bringing scientific content and scientific speakers into synagogue life. This is a mission that's very much in keeping with the vision of our congregation, the vision of making this place a hub of intellectual activity where the most significant ideas and thinkers of our day can be brought to bear on a meaningful and influential modern Jewish life. Tonight's remarks are also a prologue to the Keystone Scientist and Synagogue event, which is a symposium on Sunday, the 14th of October. On that day, we'll be learning from experts in cutting-edge scientific fields and ethics, both nationally and from here at home in our congregation. I want to urge you to join us for that symposium, and I want to thank Rebecca Lenstrup and Stephen Frank, who are some of our lay chairs making this event and this series possible. So the charge before us tonight is to explore a Jewish answer to the question, can there be an end to disease? And if so, or even if not, what would that answer mean for our humanity and our spirituality? So to begin to answer that question, we have to look back to gain a bit of historical perspective about Judaism's view of disease and of healing more generally. The earliest stages of Jewish thought held some beliefs that are very different from our understandings today. These most ancient perspectives held that sickness and healing are at their root great unknowable mysteries. The ancients had some ideas, certainly, about how disease was spread, how bodily injuries could be repaired, but they came with the underlying and constant belief that the functions of the body were essentially unknowable, that they were held securely in God's hands, God who is the ultimate, inscrutable source of life and death. They believed that not only can't we mortals understand the mysteries of the body, but for us to even explore them too deeply, to immerse ourselves in them too seriously, is a bit insubordinate. There's something disrespectful, they believed, about human beings intervening in the healing process because that domain belongs to God. God, they felt, has a plan for the human race and for each individual human body, and to try to change that plan through the magic arts of medicine and healing is an act of trespass against God's territory. That's the most ancient, the oldest layer of Jewish thinking, and we see that layer woven through the 5 books of the Torah, when it talks about childbirth and disease, illness and death. All of these things, in the words of Torah, are seen as awesome and frightening. And we'll notice that each of them in the Torah are attended by the ancient priests, not by physicians. Those priests certainly still held to the first principle that human life is paramount, that one can undertake nearly any action necessary to protect human life. But usually in the days of the Torah, this meant things like instituting legal protections to prevent accidents, encouraging people to be cautious about their safety, and so on. And it's only several hundred years later that a refinement on this point of view emerges, this time from the prophet Isaiah. Isaiah, for anyone who spent time reading his work, envisioned a world that is virtuous and godly. And he articulates the idea, and I will offer this first with the provision that the doctors in the room must not say this to their patients, that disease is a sign of sin. That when a person contracts disease, that's a sign of your moral infirmity. And that healing, in contrast, indicates that your repentance has been effective. And so when Isaiah imagines a world that is redeemed and perfected, he says, in that world, none who lives there shall say, I am sick. It shall be inhabited by those whose sin has been forgiven. Now, today, obviously, we don't blame people's illnesses or disease on their sin or on their religious lives. But Isaiah's writing does add a new dimension to Jewish thought when he proposes that disease is, in a sense, the enemy of faithful Jewish life. in the same way that sinfulness is the enemy of faithful Jewish life. And that tiny crack that he makes into the Jewish thought of antiquity will become an opening that later thinkers will peel apart to transform the way that Jews think about illness and recovery today. That opening won't widen until centuries later, but when it does, rabbis and jurists and doctors will overturn the notion that medicine is some sort of spiritual trespass. And instead, they conclude not only that physicians are permitted to practice medicine, but that they may be compelled to. The reason that they reason that since we already have a standing principle that human life is meant to be protected, and we have another standing principle that the end of disease is the parallel to the end of faithlessness, so they conclude people with the right training and the right skill are commanded to minimize disease, to heal illness, because by doing so they become God's partners in bringing about a world that Isaiah imagined, a world redeemed and perfected. This idea then becomes the dominant Jewish viewpoint for most of the rest of Jewish medical ethics and philosophy. Humans are permitted and encouraged to fight disease, to cure illness without limitation. Disease is the enemy, and health is the sign of skill of humans and favor from God. So the ideal horizon for Jewish medical ethics and the practice of medicine is the complete eradication of disease. And from one perspective, we can conclude today that we're doing pretty well in that area. Medical advances and vaccinations, improvements in community sanitation and food safety, all of these things have reduced dramatically the incidence of disease and accidents around the world. You remember that on Yom Kippur, we expressed our anxiety about who would die by fire and who by water. And since, statistically, over the last century alone, the number of people dying in fires and by drowning have gone down 90%, we may be making real progress toward the disappearance of disease, and the kingdom of God is at hand. But there is a dissenting view. There's another way of understanding our relationship with disease and illness, and it's one, as it turns out, that is specifically relevant this week, during the holiday of Sukkot. This perspective holds that disease is not morally wrong, that there is no moral dimension to illness. It's the morally neutral result of all kinds of organisms, viruses and bacteria and cancer cells, all doing their best to survive and replicate, just as they were created to do. The nature of life is that it is finite. Illness and death, weakness and infirmity are all just a part of that package. The reason that it's especially resonant on Sukkot is that that is a view articulated by a different book of the Bible that doesn't get nearly enough airtime, the book called Kohelet, or in English, Ecclesiastes. Ecclesiastes is probably best known as the author behind the number one hit single from 1965 that goes, "A time to be born, a time to die, a time to plant, a time to reap." Ecclesiastes wrote that, even though Pete Seeger got the royalties. So Ecclesiastes' take on disease and health and illness and recovery is very different from everything that came before, from the Torah or from the prophets, even from the medieval legalists that would succeed him. His writing is fascinating and very unusual. And as it turns out, the Sukkot connection is that the book of Ecclesiastes is the one specifically designated for reading during this holiday, just the same way that we read the book of Esther during Purim. And the innovation of Ecclesiastes is that he, unlike all of his predecessors, not only accepts, but embraces the fact that all of us will die. Humans are just like animals, he says. Both came from dust and both will return to dust. And no one can know what waits for us beyond the grave. And so, he reasons, there's little sense struggling to eradicate disease. And there's certainly no sense in trying to understand disease as some kind of moral or spiritual function. Sometimes, he says, good people suffer horribly. Sometimes the wicked flourish. And so, he says, we should eat and drink and be merry. All of us will die, because that's what happens to everything that lives. And because that's the fate that awaits all of us, he suggests, it's a waste of time making ourselves overly preoccupied with pushing away disease, with preserving life at any cost. Instead, we should concentrate on how we conduct ourselves during the time that is given us and enjoying the limited time we have. You might know Ecclesiastes' other number one lyric, vanity of vanities, all is vanity. A better translation of that Hebrew might be something like, everything is fleeting, nothing is permanent. Life is short, life is temporary. Nothing substantive or tangible will be left of it after it is gone. Life is impermanent, life is stubbornly out of our control. But to Ecclesiastes, to quote the software engineers, that quality of life is a feature and not a bug. That's the way life was intended to be. Our mortality and our impermanence is what God thoughtfully and deliberately encoded into us and into all life. We are porous vessels, permeable to the outside world, susceptible to the influences of our environment, our mates, our personal choices. That's what makes us vulnerable to disease, but it's also what makes us vulnerable to joy and to purpose. Like all animals, we will die, but the fact that we know we will makes us different from them. We can use that insight to help craft lives of meaning. Ecclesiastes says, yes, sure, we can focus on the fact that people get hurt or sick and then get better, but by focusing only on that, we miss the point of being alive. And by ignoring the fact that in real life, sometimes the sick don't get better. Sometimes chronic illness does prevail. Sometimes the struggling organ fails. By ignoring that and holding only to Isaiah's metaphor about illness as a spiritual malady, we may come to the mistaken conclusion that contracting illness or disease means that we have failed. But Ecclesiastes, who is our guide this Sukkot, Ecclesiastes says no. Our porousness, our vulnerability is why we were put here in the first place. That's why God made us mortal as we are. And in the face of that truth, to eat and drink and be merry is not hedonism, but spiritual resistance. That's what Ecclesiastes calls us into during this season. Our partnership with scientists and synagogues has invited us to explore the question of whether there may be an end to disease, to explore what the meaning of finding an answer to that question may be. Ecclesiastes refuses to answer the question altogether. He says it's an utterly irrelevant question because disease and illness, strength and recovery is all just a part of the deal. It comes as part of the package of being human, and there's no sense of hoping for purpose beyond that. The hunt for an end to disease, Ecclesiastes suggests, is the ultimate vanity of vanities. And instead of focusing on that quest, we should concentrate our time and our energy on making our days on earth full of joy and meaning and learning. And I will be very excited to join you to learn from the scientists who will share their perspective when we gather together for their symposium on Sunday, the 14th of October. Shabbat Shalom.